Excellent. So I think we're going to start. So thank you so much, first of all, to the organizers, to the arts and culture team, and also to Kate Baker from Agile Rabbit for setting all of this up and inviting us to come along to talk about a project that we've been involved in for, I think, almost 2.5 years now. It's really been a long, complex project called Adventures in Time and Gender. So I'm Jana Funke, and my colleague is Kate Fischer, and we were involved in leading and participating in this long-term project. I'm in English, Kate is in history. So the project we're talking about, Adventures in Time and Gender, ended up being a 3-part drama podcast that was released last October. Online, and there was also a website that accompanied the podcast that Kate will talk about a little bit more later on as well. And it's a podcast that engages with trans, non-binary, and also queer histories in a very creative, playful way. And of course, I would invite all of you to have a look at the website and listen to the podcast later. So Kate and I are really representing a huge team, and I'm really glad to say that 2 team members, Dr. Ina Ling and Dr. Jen Grove, are also here today in the room. So Jen, Ina, please feel free to come in later in the discussion and share your insights and your thoughts as well. So it was a team of academic collaborators from different humanities disciplines, loads of different creative practitioners and artists, and you can see the core collaborators on the slide here. It was also a collaboration between the Rethinking Sexology project at Exeter, which is a Wellcome Trust funded project about the history of Western sexology, looking at the late 19th, early 20th century. A collaboration with Gendered Intelligence. They are a leading national charity supporting young trans non-binary people. And the whole thing was funded by the Wellcome Trust. And it was quite generously funded, which was really, really important, I think, in terms of giving us flexibility to make changes later on, and also allowing us to make people feel appreciated and valued, and that we could pay for their time and also pay for time to develop new ideas, which we had to do when we had to adjust the project as a result of the pandemic. So when we first applied for the project, it was meant to be a performance, a live performance that would tour around different cities in the UK. And then we will talk later about the process of radically changing all of those plans and adjusting them due to the pandemic last year, and having to turn what was meant to be a physical performance into a recorded podcast, which was quite a big change. And we're going to focus on that process today. But this was quite a complex project, as you can see, involving loads of different people and also involving loads of different stages, which we'll talk about. But I also want to mention Jason Barker, who can't be here today, but he's really the hero of this project in a sense. He was the creative writer who held all of these different strands together and produced the podcast and wrote the podcast and the script, taking on all of the different voices from young trans non-binary people, from the academics, from other artists, doing his own research, bringing in his own perspectives. And he really did a brilliant job in holding all of that together, which I think was a huge, huge challenge. And I'm sure he has a whole story to tell about his involvement in the project as well. But these were the different stages. So one goal of the project was not just for academics to work with artists to develop the performance or later the podcast, but also to really engage young trans non-binary people, which we recruited through Gendered Intelligence, and engage the young people with the histories of sexology, with trans and queer history more broadly, and to then, on that basis, develop the performance and the script. So in that sense, there was a process of co-production, collaboration built into the making of the script. And these were the different stages that you can see on the slide. And we were going to very briefly talk you through those stages, but please feel free to ask us any questions about the process, about how we ran the project, about the challenges we encountered. We're very happy to talk about that later on as well. So the first stage was a series of history workshops, which were happening in 2019, before the pandemic, when we could still be in the same space as the young people. So these all took place in Bristol over the course of 4 weeks. So we had Saturdays where we spent the whole day with the young people. So different academics coming together. Jason was always there, and also Bon O'Hara, who is a youth worker from Gendered Intelligence. They were there to support the project and support the young people through the process as well. And we used a number of different creative methods from performance. So you can see Kazuki Yamada, Dr. Ina Linge, and me dressed up as some of the sexologists on the top left. We used collaging, storytelling, creative writing. We tried to recreate certain spaces and take young people on a tour of those spaces. So really trying to find different ways of making the sexological material, which can be quite dry, can be quite difficult, quite inaccessible, to make that come to life and give the young people a chance to engage with those sources. We also brought in other speakers to bring in other forms of expertise and other forms of knowledge as well. So Campbell X, Dr. Francis Ray White, Cheryl Morgan, Krishna Ista, Ruth Pierce, Kate O'Donnell. All of these different people came in to share their perspective and their knowledge as well. And this was a really important part of the project to also build networks. And loads of these people would be involved in later stages of the project as well. So in that moment, in that phase, we generated a lot of feedback and insights from the young people that would then later on shape the performance. And the next stage was the oral history strand of the project, which Kate will talk about.
So yes, here the idea was that on top of working with historical material based on existing archives and documentary material, we would create a new archive based on interviews with older trans people, people who were born between, I can't remember how old the oldest one was, but basically, you know, the last 50, 60, 70 years. And the idea was that we would train and bring our young trans participants into this process. They would conduct the interviews with the older trans volunteers. So we had one day of training in techniques and the ethics and the methodology of oral history. And after that, formal interviews were conducted and recorded. So we produced hours of life history testimony. But this was more than just kind of data gathering. We did it over a course of a weekend in one holiday house, pictured here in Weston-super-Mare. So it became a form of community building as well, where the entire team of participants spent hours together chatting, eating, and discussing the value of trans history. The material that then was created was fully transcribed, ready to feed into the next stages. And the next stage is the writer's room, which Jana will tell you about.
Yes, so this again was something that still happened physically in the space in Bristol. So I was there representing the academic team. Jason was there, Bon O'Hara was there from Gender Intelligence, and then a group of young people from Gender Intelligence came back. And this was quite a challenging stage in the sense that we had all this material. We had hours of oral histories. We had all the historical stuff that had been workshopped in the March workshops. So really a lot of material. And then Jason had to lead this process of being in a writer's room with all of us and to turn this into what we still thought would be a physical live performance in theater spaces. And I could talk a lot about this process, but I think what was really important thinking about the changes we made later on is that in that moment, we were all really, really invested in this being a physical performance. We're talking a lot about the idea of having a community space, having people come together, being visible as a trans-led project and the importance of that. Also thinking about the dramaturgy and the kind of physicality of performance and what you can do on stage and what it means for bodies and voices to be there physically. And obviously all of that was later on lost when we had to make that change. And that was really difficult and painful because we were so invested in seeing this as a physical performance. But basically, after the writer's room, Jason went away and he wrote a script for a live performance, which we then read. And Kate will talk a little bit about that process of us engaging with the script and then realizing that we would have to change it.
Yes, so this is the kind of slide which we're labeling the kind of pivot moment. So we have a first draft of the performance in front of us. We're really excited about it. And we started to begin a kind of process of workshopping it, of working with Jason and helping Jason, you know, move it through the next drafts and bringing in all the participants so it becomes a co-produced and collaborative piece of work. So you can see some of the kind of tweets we were writing at the time about how excited we were. And we were very slow to realize that once the pandemic came, we would not be able to realize this at all, that a live theatre performance was completely not viable. For a while, we held on to those hopes, and I've put the tweet up, which I really liked, that Catherine McNamara produced, and it's a kind of wistful and sad tweet. It's written in May, and it was responding to an invitation to find the last picture of your normal life on the phone, and it was a picture of a sketch of what the stage might look like. So it really kind of captures the excitement that we had about the physical presence of our performance, which at this point was still in play, but we were beginning to realize that something would not happen, and we were promising that something might happen in July. But this is the moment at which we really had to revise completely, and Jana will tell you how we went through that process.
Yeah, so basically, if you remember what kind of mental state we were in March, April last year, I mean, we really didn't know how long this would last. And so I think there was a sense that we were still quite hopeful that we might be able to do a performance later on in the year. But then we also, as Kate said, kind of realized that it was just too unpredictable. And we should also mention that we were under the pressures of the ref deadline. So both Kate and I produced an impact case study based on this. And the original deadline was meant to be the summer of 2021. They then extended it, but we knew basically that this had to happen sooner rather than later. And there was also a timeliness, I think, about the material. And so we basically didn't want to make a decision without the young people because they had been so involved in the process. And because of that, we decided to have an online writers' room in April 2020, so last year, April. And the young people, Bon, Jason, and I came together for the second online writers' room. And we're going to focus on that moment a little bit more because we were asked to talk about the pivot moment for this particular presentation. So first of all, Zoom was a whole new thing for us. I hadn't done any Zoom sessions, and we had also developed a very careful safeguarding protocol for the March workshops with gendered intelligence. And we had to really think about how to translate that into an online space. And so it's worth thinking, for instance, that about the fact that some of the young people were in living situations where they weren't out necessarily. So some of them couldn't participate by speaking. They were writing in the chat instead and listening on headphones to avoid outing themselves as trans or queer. So there were all of those kind of safeguarding issues that we had to consider. But at the same time, as you can also see on the slide, it was a very, very affirmative experience, I think, just to feel like we were feeling totally isolated. And here was a chance to come together and to talk about something that we were all invested in quite a lot at this point. And so we basically used the writer's room. We were meeting over lunch for 1 week for like 1 or 2 hours to just talk about how can we take this into an online space. And then we ended up with the idea of it being a podcast and having to make quite a lot of changes. And also thinking about our audience was meant to be specifically young, trans, and queer people. So we were asking a lot of questions about, well, how can we make sure that that particular audience actually accesses the podcast, that it speaks to that audience? And there was loads of learning involved in that process because I and Jason, we had never, no one on the team had really developed or produced a podcast before. So we really had to do a lot of learning. And there was also a lot of sadness and a sense of loss of the possibilities that we couldn't really pursue in that moment. So as I said earlier, this idea of having a community and being in a space together, having a space where trans, non-binary, and also queer people would dominate, that's such an important part of the project, and that was lost. Also the kind of political importance of it being an event, being a presence in the real world, taking up space in the real world, that was really important for the project. Aesthetically, and this was a huge challenge for Jason, I mean, the physical aspects of the performance, the dramaturgy that had been developed, the staging, the lighting, the sound effects, I mean, all of that had to be radically rethought. The structure had to change. So it was initially thought of as a 2-act play, and it ended up being a 3-part podcast. I actually think the structure helped in the end, but we didn't know that at the beginning. And I think Jason had a huge challenge to deal with. And there were also some collaborators like Dr. Catherine McNamara, who is a specialist in performance and live theater. And there were questions about her role on the project moving forward once it had changed. And it was important to keep her in the loop and keep her as part of the conversation as well, so that no one felt dropped or kind of written out of the process without being consulted. So this was a really challenging moment where we as a team had to have a lot of conversations and coordinate while also leading a process and moving it forward, and not just kind of like being totally passive and stalling. So I found that one of the hardest moments. And as I said, loads of sadness and loss, but also gains and benefits, which Kate will talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. So alongside the feeling that we had an exciting plan that we had to abandon, we were quickly quite enthused by the new plan, and particularly excited that we were, as it were, doing something that gave particular benefits within a pandemic context. So for many people involved in the project, being part of an active creative community during a period of isolation was we were told, genuinely helpful, genuinely exciting, and genuinely kept supportive communities alive that were struggling to find, whose normal ways of interacting and connecting had been disrupted. It was a joy to be able to give work and to pay properly work to a variety of artists, performers, writers, directors, sound directors during a period of enormous crisis for people working in the arts. So that was it was very emotionally powerful to feel that during this point of time when our work was so disrupted, that we could be actively working to mitigate against some of the negative impacts of the pandemic. Producing a podcast did, while taking away that kind of physical presence in the world, it did enable us to reach different audiences and wider audiences than we had originally planned. I think later on you'll get a map of where around the world people have listened to the podcast, but we were able to become international and global in a way that we hadn't originally planned. We were able to reach people who were not based in the kind of cities, which were were largely big cities across the UK, and not that many of them. We were able to kind of reach out into the more isolated trans communities around the country. And having a podcast means that we have an ongoing audience. The impact hasn't stopped. That it's not a case that the show is over and everything's packed up. It's still there. It's still happening. But above all, I want to kind of flag up the website. So we had kept money aside for a as yet unfleshed out accompanying foyer exhibition or some kind of program of curated material that would accompany the theatrical tour. We envisaged that people coming to a theatre or contemplating buying a ticket or attending a performance would be able to find out more, would be able to get additional material about the project and about the historical information that informed it. We had not been at all advanced in our planning of this. And so we were able to go back to the drawing board completely once we committed to being having an online presence rather than a physical presence. But we had developed a relationship with a brilliant designer called Zed, and I would really like to flag up their work, which is truly outstanding. And we continued in this collaboration. And I think they suggested that what we could do was host the podcast on a website that itself was a kind of dynamic place that would enrich the material in the podcast, would expand on it, would showcase some of the ideas and themes that had been produced in the workshops. And we wanted this to be something creative, something new, and something that would showcase trans talent. So we asked various trans artists, activists, and others to respond to the historical material and the themes that were emerging. And Zed worked these into an extraordinary layered and dynamic website. I would really invite you to have an explore of it. I haven't been able to this is my technical inabilities, but simple screenshots of it don't work because things move and shift all over the page. So instead, I've just given you a snapshot of some of the tweets that we put out to highlight some of the kind of rich material that is there. But, you know, so for example, one of the elements of the workshops had been introducing trans people to some medieval texts that told stories of gender transformation and some ancient material. These were worked into a new performance of some of the ancient material and a performance poem based on the medieval stories. We had an amazing envisaging of what Virginia Woolf's Orlando might have got up to in lockdown, and they were that created another wormhole, as we call these things. I won't go on because I think we're running out of time, but do take a look. Now, one element meant that this bit of the project didn't involve the trans participants so much, and I think that is another kind of loss of the pandemic. At this point, we were really short of time. The draft deadline forced us to get our website up and running and reaching audiences before December. But at the same time, we have created a kind of artistic showcase for trans artists, which I find very rich and powerful, inspiring and moving. Yeah.
Yes, so I'm going to be very quick about the kind of production process of the podcast. Obviously, we now had a script that Jason had written. We didn't have a podcast that sounded good and sounded professional. And so I think this is really where we had built networks throughout the process. So Krishna Ista, who had been there in the March workshops, they then became the producer and the director of the podcast. And Jason, of course, continued to be involved. And then really they took the lead in developing and producing the podcast. And I think this really came through in the evaluation report that Kate will talk about in a second. But I think what happened here, and that the project where we have been quite centrally involved and the young trans people have been quite centrally involved, it now shifted into a creative project led by trans non-binary artists and creatives. And we really took a step back. And I think Kate and I are really in agreement that that's in creative projects is a really important moment where as an academic, you have a say, you have your voice, you have your input, but there also comes a moment where you have to take a step back and take yourself out of the creative process and let it be what it is. And in this project in particular, we wanted it to be a trans-led community project. And so we took a step back, and that happened really without our direct involvement. We did have weekly team meetings, but we were kind of more supporting people at that moment and letting the creative process take place. As Kate said, it had to happen within a few months because of the ref pressures, which we also had to communicate to people outside of the university who were like, why are you so stressed about the ref? Like, why is that deadline so important? And like communicating that was something we really had to do because the deadlines were really, really difficult to deal with at times. But in any case, it happened. I think it sounds brilliant. We were so impressed with the results. And then, yeah, the website was launched with the podcasts. And then we had a few more months to kind of get the message out there. We were supported here by Campbell X, who was our social media strategist. Again, you saw him earlier on the slide giving a talk in the March workshops, and he came back later in the process and did a brilliant job in really creating an audience for the podcast and making sure that we had listeners and people who accessed the website. And we learned so much working with him, who was absolutely brilliant. So I think we can be quick now in summarizing the outcomes and the findings.
Yeah, so I just want to flag up the importance of evaluation and fully funded evaluation to the project. We gave a lot of our budget to evaluation. We brought in an evaluator from the start. She monitored things stage by stage and gave us regular feedback. And I think this was really important at the point at which we pivoted, because at that point we had a real sense of what the project could achieve, what it was achieving, what bits of it were working, so that we could embed them into the next stage. And as we now have a 60-page report, which is really, really full of extraordinary detail about what we achieved, how we achieved it, and what challenges we faced. So I would recommend that as a form of process.
Yep, and this is just to conclude. This was the numbers until the end of December last year, which was the ref deadline. So on the 31st, I took the screenshot because that was like the final ref numbers. We're now up to almost 4,000 podcast listens and many more website visits. And as Kate said, that kind of reach in terms of audience numbers, in terms of a global reach, we would never have had that through physical performance. So that was a huge gain in terms of our impact and our reach. And we've got loads of really, really positive messages from people who've listened and engaged with the project. And they are all in the evaluation report, which I'll post in the chat. So I think we'll end here to leave some time for questions. And I want to stop sharing my slides. And I just want to say that Professor Rebecca Langlands has joined us, who was another crucial team member. So I'm excited that Rebecca is here as well. So as we said to Jen and Ina, please join the conversation, Rebecca, if you have anything to share or to add. But any questions or comments about the process?
I have a question actually about just thinking as we come out of the pandemic, whenever that's going to be. There's been a lot of chat about hybrid engagement. So taking some of the learnings from during this period when everything has had to be online, which for some people has been amazing for accessibility reasons. But have you thought about, how you could mix this sort of online stuff with in-person engagement for your next project?
I mean, we are in conversations right now about the legacy of this project, and that's something we need to develop. We still have a year to spend some of the funding, so we're trying to think what to do next. In terms of blended engagement, I'm sure I will take some of this learning forward, but I have found it really difficult to do this work in online spaces. And I don't find that with teaching, for instance. Like, I quite liked online teaching, but I think in particular here, with issues about people not feeling able to say certain things in their home spaces, not being out, not being able to articulate themselves freely. There's something to be said, I think, with regard to trans or queer projects about taking people into spaces where you feel some degree of safety, and you're removed from home spaces that might not be fully supportive. So with a particular project with a queer or trans focus, I would really like to return to physical spaces and to just have that zone that you can work with and that space to work with. So in that sense, I would be keen to move away from blended and move into physical spaces again. But beyond that, I think in terms of sharing work, and I think we've learned a lot about building online audiences and sharing work online in engaging ways. Kate, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, well, I would add that, it's a bit like TV, which is a form of, engagement, a virtual engagement that we have with creativity, what we've had for a very long time. And we all know that it enriches our lives. We like it. We watch TV all the time, but none of us have then said we never need theatre anymore. We do recognize that there is something quite special about being in the same place as other people. So no one's going to kind of take away your TV, but at the same time, no one's going to abandon theatre, I hope.
Rebecca.
Sorry, I slightly pressed the hand by mistake, but I was thinking, just building on what you were saying about the sort of particular benefit of meeting people in person in this quite a sort of, complicated situation. But I think that it's also more generally applicable to the engagement of academics with non-academic audiences, because there's often huge kind of assumptions and kind of anxieties around hierarchies that people bring to collaborations with us. And obviously this is something we really kind of grappled with a lot over the years in all sorts of different contexts. And actually, I mean, both online and in person, there are real potentials for kind of disrupting that and creating spaces where people feel more comfortable. And obviously the workshops that, I mean, this project would have been very different had we not had those really intense in-person workshops at the beginning. And part of the sort of stuff there was gradually kind of relaxing into some fun and having like people dressing up in silly costumes, academics doing that, and I think that's something both in person and online to really think about. They have different potential for kind of enabling that kind of breaking down of hierarchies and making people feel like they can engage with us. We don't feel frightening, but somehow we are.
I think that's particularly relevant to the oral history stage, because on the one hand, you think, well, what do you need for an oral history project? You just need two people able to talk to each other. Surely you can do that virtually. Why would we ever travel to somebody's house to interview them anymore? But actually, it is so much more than just the moment when you are recording the interview, and it is very difficult to replicate some of that social emotional work that is like at the heart of it when you are doing it not face to face in the same room.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think also the March workshops were so important in building trust. We didn't really talk about that process of, we were coming in as a group of like cis academics, the young trans non-binary people didn't know us. And I think there was a lot of work we did to build trust. And that happened mainly by having coffee and having chats over lunch. And I think doing that online would have been almost impossible. So I think, as Rebecca said, we needed those early stages to get to know the young people. And then coming into an online space was a totally different thing. Ina, you have your hand up as well.
Well, we've also got a question in the chat that I don't know if we should take first.
Let Ina speak quickly so that we don't
You can park my question until later as well. I just wanted to ask, obviously I was like a small part of the project early on in the workshops, but I hope it's not too contrived to ask a question anyway. And it's about the evaluation, and obviously Esther's evaluation report is like a work of art on its own, and it's really amazing. And but it's a lot of work, and I just wondered if you could say a little bit about evaluation and how you kind of thought about building that into the project early on. It might actually be a question for Jen as well, but just a kind of sort of quick tips about how to think about evaluation beyond a sort of questionnaire at the end of the
so I'm going to give you 2 tips, and one is fund it. Like, it's expensive to do really, really good evaluation, which is built into every stage, and then you give the time to the researcher to really work with the material, to digest it, to build on it, and then go back and run focus groups. It is really expensive, but the other thing that I would say is one of the tensions with evaluation is that people get very tired of evaluation. They get tired of the stupid survey that you get given at the end of every workshop you go to. And the genius of Esther is to build her evaluation into the things that you're already doing anyway. So we would say, in the workshop we're planning on doing this activity, this creative thing, and she would say, right, if you do it like this, then it will give me data to work with, so that the people who are involved, the participants, do not, as it were, see the evaluation quite so clunkily.
I agree. I mean, there's more to say about this, but I do want to take Sarah's question, as Kate said as well. So the question is, having had to take such a sharp pivot for this project, has it changed how we feel about pivoting? And I think it has. And I recently had to pivot a lot with another project I'm running with the RAM in Exeter. So this happened after this project. And I think this project gave me a lot of confidence and faith that I can be part of a project where we have to make radical changes and how to do that. And I think the main thing I've learned is that see the benefits. I mean, acknowledge the losses, as we also try to do in the conversation. It's okay to be upset about that, and also to let other people feel what they feel about those losses, but then also focus on the benefits and the excitement of new possibilities. And I think Kate outlined them very well in the presentation. But then the other thing is, as I also said in the presentation, like, you have to take people with you. And I think we really try to make a point to talk with all the academics, all the creatives, the young people, the other collaborators, and really have meetings with each of those groups, or more than one meeting, to make them feel like this is maybe not ideal. It's not what we envisioned. There will be losses, but how can we do this together in ways that work for us as much as possible? And just giving that time to the development, and again, having the funding to pay people for that development time, which you don't anticipate. And that was the joy of this project, is that we have generous funding to make people feel like, okay, we might have to add 2 months of work, but we're also going to be paid for this.
I would add to that being like building the possibility of pivoting into your planning is really important from the start. And I think this process has kind of reinforced that, but I think we were there already. I remember that writing the application was really, really hard, because you're meant to sort of lay out your plans, but actually what we wanted to say is we want to do this thing with these participants, and we don't know what will come out, but we want it to inform what happens next. And then what happens next will produce an idea that will turn into this. But your funders want to say, what is the outcome? What do you want to do? And saying, well, it's all going to be co-produced and collaborative and, you know, really fun, but we don't yet know, isn't really viable. But that was the framework that we started with. And maybe, you know, maybe that kind of articulation might be easier once people kind of realize that that pivoting is central to the way work is produced.
Absolutely. I think we probably have to wrap up here. I just want to ask whether Ina, Jen, Rebecca have anything to add before we conclude? No? Which is good because we're already running over. I just want to make sure that everyone has a chance to say what they want to say. I'm going to share my slides quickly just so that you know what the next events are. So Education Incubator panel at 1 o'clock, and then a discussion about the slow ritual of care, which sounds really interesting, at 2:15, and then close of the event at 3 o'clock. So I'm going to be at some of those events, definitely. But again, thank you so much to everyone involved in organizing this. And it was really great to be here. And there's other comments in the chat as well to look at. But thank you so much. And if you have any other questions, email any of us, and we're always happy to discuss any of this further. Thank you.
Bye-bye.